Hello, 8th grade. Today we're going to be learning about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So this is a law or a bill that becomes a law involving the Kansas and Nebraska territories, which, as you know, are going to turn into states in the Union. So with that in mind, let's start things off right. Uh, there's a father and son in Kansas, and the son asks the father, "Dad, what do buzzards in Kansas eat?" And the father says, "Carrion, my wayward son." If you don't know the band Kansas, then I guess you didn't get that joke, but it's all right. Um, I would tell a joke about Nebraska, but it's too corny. Okay. Um, we are on slide 11. We're going to be learning first about Uncle Tom's Cabin and the effect that this had on slavery or on the slavery debate in the Union. So it's the year 1852. There's an abolitionist woman from the North named Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she's a writer. And she decides she wants to write a story that is going to convince people that slavery is morally evil. Right? That's her goal. She feels very strongly that slavery is a scourge on the nation and that the United States needs to outlaw slavery forever. And so she thinks the best way to do this is to convince people that slavery is evil by writing this story, which turns into a novel titled Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin is a fictional story, um, but the way it describes the horrors of slavery are very graphic and realistic, right? So this novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, is going to become one of the most influential books ever written. It causes literally thousands of Americans to change their minds about slavery. So a lot of Americans who are neutral on the slavery issue, don't think it's very important. They read Uncle Tom's Cabin and they're so horrified by the treatment of the slaves in Uncle Tom's Cabin that they basically start to believe that slavery is evil, and many of them become abolitionists. Likewise, even a lot of people who are formally pro-slavery read Uncle Tom's Cabin, and they realize it like opens their eyes to the reality of the horrors that come with owning another human being. Um, so it causes thousands of Americans to care a lot more about the slavery issue and to view it as more than just like a political issue. They start to see it as a moral issue as well. Southerners who are pro slavery, meanwhile, hate Uncle Tom's Cabin. They think it's propaganda, right? They think it creates a very inaccurate picture of slavery. They think the way it describes slavery is exaggerated and makes slavery out to be a lot worse than it is. And so they think Uncle Tom's Cabin is basically not so much an anti slavery book, but an anti South book, right? They're insulted by it. Okay, so yeah, I just had to include a quick slide there about Uncle Tom's Cabin because you can't study the history of American slavery without knowing about Uncle Tom's Cabin and the impact that it had on the slavery debate. Okay, so far we've seen three things that accelerate the nation towards war, uh, North versus South, in what will eventually be the Civil War. So the first thing we learned about was the Mexican-American War, because the issue of the Mexican Cession reignited what the Missouri Compromise had kind of dampened, right? What do we do about this delicate balance in Congress between slave states and free states, right? The Mexican Cession throws a wrench in that balance that the Missouri Compromise struck. The second thing that accelerates the nation towards civil war is the Compromise of 1850, which makes both sides very upset, especially because of the Fugitive Slave Act within the Compromise of 1850, which enrages the North. And then, of course, the third issue is the publishing of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which also enrages the North and the South and creates even a greater division between these two sides on the issue of slavery. So, quick note here, we live in a political environment that's very polarized, right? The nation is very divided between Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals, right? There's all kinds of issues that split our country very strongly right now. And remember, George Washington, in his farewell address, gave a speech saying that political polarization is really, really bad. But if you go back to our lesson on George Washington, this was a few months ago, one of the questions I asked you is political polarization always bad? Right? In George Washington's mind, political polarization, meaning tension between two groups, the two-party system, in George Washington's mind, that was going to split the nation in half. And George Washington was right. It did split the nation in half in the Civil War. But is political polarization always bad? That's what I asked back then. And the reason I asked that question is because I had in mind issues like the one we're studying now, the issue of slavery. What if the country wasn't so polarized about slavery? What if only a small number of Americans felt really strongly one way or the other about slavery, but most Americans in the mushy middle were kind of like, yeah, slavery makes me uncomfortable, or I support slavery, but it's not something I think about very much. Right? Do you think that the slavery issue would have been resolved? Probably not. Right? It's true the nation would not have accelerated towards a terrible civil war, but the Civil War was the price that had to be paid to get rid of slavery. Without the Civil War, it is very unlikely that slavery gets outlawed in the 19th century. Right? There's a good chance that without the Civil War, slavery would have existed in the 20th century in the United States. Right? So sometimes political polarization, even if it leads to war, is a necessary evil in order to get rid of an even greater evil, which slavery was. Okay, so we're going to learn now about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is the fourth major event that pushes the nation towards civil war. So what is the Kansas-Nebraska Act? Well, it does a few things. Number one, the Kansas-Nebraska Act gets rid of the Missouri Compromise. So basically what it says is there's this new territory in the Union. It's part of the Louisiana Purchase. It's called the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory. Now, both of these territories are north of the southern border of Missouri, and both of these territories are part of the Louisiana Purchase. So under the terms of the Missouri Compromise, Kansas and Nebraska, if they become states, they have to become free states. Right? They can't have slavery. So when it becomes clear that Kansas and Nebraska are moving towards statehood, Southerners get really, really upset because this is going to shift the balance of power away from the South towards the North in Congress. Right? So to appease the South, to allow Kansas and Nebraska to enter the Union as states, there is a senator named Stephen Douglas. Sorry, I had to double check that. There's a senator named Stephen Douglas who decides to make a deal with the South. And he proposes something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And under the terms of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Kansas and Nebraska are admitted to the Union as states, right? But the Missouri Compromise is nullified. So it gets rid of the Missouri Compromise. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act says the issue of slavery in Kansas and Nebraska is going to be decided by popular sovereignty. That means the vote of white citizens. So white male citizens of Kansas and Nebraska are going to vote on whether or not slavery is going to be legal in Kansas and Nebraska. So obviously the South is happy about this because they think, okay, Kansas and Nebraska are near Missouri. Missouri is a slave state. So basically, they're going to probably vote like Missouri did. They're going to vote in favor of slavery. Right? The North, of course, is really mad about the Kansas-Nebraska Act because they think Kansas and Nebraska are going to vote to allow slavery. And they're also mad because the whole point of the Missouri Compromise was with dealing with problems like this. So they're like, why did we agree to the Missouri Compromise if we were just going to get rid of it just because the South is mad? Right? So they feel like they got cheated. The South is happy about this. So Northerners are really, really mad. So yeah, the Northerners realize Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to cause the North to lose a lot of would-be free states to slavery. President Franklin Pierce, he's president at this time. Millard Fillmore's out. Franklin Pierce is president. He signs this bill into law because he thinks the Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to save the country from civil war, just like the Missouri Compromise supposedly saved the nation from civil war. The reality is neither one of these helped. Both of these compromises actually pushed the United States towards civil war. So President Franklin Pierce was wrong. All right, so under the act, the legality of slavery in these territories that are going to become states are going to come down to the vote. Right? So at the time of the vote in the state of Kansas in 1855, there's only 3,000 legally registered voters. Yet in reality, 8,000 votes were cast. Right? So there's 3,000 voters, but when they go to count how many votes there are, there's 8,000 of them. So somebody cheated. So what happened? Right? Well, the reality is that what ended up happening is slave owners or pro-slavery advocates from Missouri, Arkansas, and places like the Indian Territory, which is modern-day Oklahoma, they flood into Kansas and they vote illegally. Right? Remember, only people who are citizens of the Kansas Territory are supposed to vote. Right? But before the election, all of these thousands of pro-slavery advocates move into Kansas and they vote illegally in favor of slavery. Right? Now, to be fair, a lot of Northerners who are abolitionists do this too. And one of these guys is a guy named John Brown, who we're going to learn about a little bit. John Brown is kind of like a crazy person, and he's an abolitionist. Okay, so the issue of slavery is at stake here. So thousands of white men flood into Kansas to vote illegally. So instead of having 3,000 voters, you now have 8,000 voters. So 5,000 voted illegally. Slavery wins big, but because the vote is clearly illegal, a lot of anti-slavery people in Kansas refuse to accept the results, and they form their own Kansas government, separate from the official government of Kansas. And fighting breaks out. There's a lot of pro-slavery government officials in Kansas that start to get attacked by anti-slavery mobs. And John Brown, this guy, is one of these anti-slavery activists leading these attacks. In fact, he's from Connecticut. So he travels all the way from Connecticut into Kansas, and he brings a posse of anti-slavery men with him, and he murders 5 pro-slavery people. Right? He murders, I think it's a family of, he only murders the men and the boys, but he does murder them. Right? And this leads to an explosion of violence in Kansas. And this is where Kansas gets the nickname Bleeding Kansas.